In 1884, a cartographer in Brussels drew borders across Central Africa for territories no European had ever seen. He divided land between nations that had never set foot there. Within 20 years, those lines on a map had become the borders of actual countries. Not because they reflected any geographic, cultural, or historical reality. Because the map was treated as more authoritative than the land itself. The Berlin Conference lasted from November 1884 to February 1885. 14 European nations attended. Not a single African leader was invited. Not a single African representative was consulted. The purpose was simple: divide Africa. Prevent European wars over African territory. Make the division orderly, legal, recognized. The mapmaker drawing the borders had never been to Africa. He worked from earlier maps. Maps drawn by explorers, maps drawn by missionaries, maps that were incomplete, maps that were inaccurate, maps that showed rivers in the wrong places and mountains that did not exist. But they were the only maps available, so he used them. And the borders he drew became real, because the European powers agreed to treat them as real. The conference established rules. If a European nation claimed African territory, they had to notify other European powers. They had to establish effective occupation. They had to prove they controlled the territory. But control did not mean governing the people who lived there. It meant planting a flag, building a fort, stationing soldiers. The people who had lived on that land for generations were not consulted about which European flag would fly over them. They were not asked if they wanted to be governed by France or Britain or Belgium or Germany. Their consent was not required, because the map said the land belonged to Europe now, and the map was law. Historian Thomas Pakenham spent years documenting how the scramble for Africa unfolded. His research makes clear that the Berlin Conference did not create the scramble. It formalized it. Before 1884, European powers were already claiming African territory. The conference turned claims into treaties. It turned explorers into governors. It turned ink into borders. And once the borders were drawn, they became fixed, even when they made no sense. One border ran straight through the middle of a kingdom that had existed for centuries. The kingdom was split. Half became French, half became British. The people on both sides spoke the same language, worshipped the same way, had the same king. But the map said they were now two different countries, so they were. Another border followed a river. But the mapmaker did not know the river changed course every rainy season. Within 5 years, villages that were supposed to be in one country found themselves in another. Not because they moved, because the river did. The treaties signed at Berlin were binding on Europeans. The Africans living in the territories had no legal standing. They could not challenge the borders. They could not appeal. They could not negotiate, because they were not parties to the treaty. They were the territory being divided. Mahmoud Dani's analysis of colonial borders focuses on what happened after the maps were drawn. He argues that the arbitrary borders were not mistakes. They were strategy. Dividing ethnic groups made them easier to control. Creating countries with no shared language or culture made unified resistance harder. The confusion was the point. Because confused populations do not rebel. They fight each other. And while they fight each other, they do not fight the colonizers. The borders drawn in 1884 are still the borders today. Almost every African country uses the colonial borders as their national borders. Not because those borders make sense. Not because they reflect the reality of the people living there. But because changing them would require agreements between countries that do not trust each other. And redrawing one border would call every other border into question. So the borders remain, frozen in place by a mapmaker who never saw the land he was dividing. The conflicts those borders created are still being fought. Ethnic groups split by colonial borders are still divided. Kingdoms that were whole are still separated. Rivers that moved are still defining borders that no longer match the ground. And people are still dying because a man in Brussels drew a line on a map in 1884. The mapmaker name was not preserved. The specific cartographer who drew the borders is not recorded in most histories. Because he was not important. He was following instructions, drawing lines where the diplomats told him to. He was a tool. The borders were the product of political negotiation, not geographic knowledge. The Europeans at Berlin were not trying to create stable countries. They were trying to avoid war with each other. African stability was not a consideration. African borders were drawn to separate European claims, not to create functional nations. And when those borders became national borders after decolonization, the dysfunction was built in. Countries with no coast, countries with no water, countries where the capital city is in one ethnic region and 90% of the population is in another. There is a museum in Brussels now. It has maps from the Berlin Conference. The borders visible, the ink faded but still legible. The museum does not say much about what those borders cost. It presents them as history, as documents, as artifacts of a time when Europe controlled the world. It does not talk about the wars those borders caused, the famines, the genocides, the conflicts that are still unresolved because the borders make no sense and cannot be changed. The map is presented as a map, not as a weapon. But that is what it was, a weapon that killed millions of people who never saw it. The cartographer did not intend to cause suffering. He was drawing lines, following orders, doing his job. But intent does not matter when the result is a century of violence. The borders were arbitrary. That was not a flaw. It was the design. Because arbitrary borders keep populations divided, and divided populations are easier to rule. The Berlin Conference ended in February 1885. The treaties were signed, the maps were finalized, the borders were set, and Africa was carved into pieces by people who had never been there, for purposes that had nothing to do with the people who lived there. The map became more real than the reality, and the people on the ground have been living with the consequences ever since. The borders were not natural, they were not historical, they were not negotiated with the people they affected. They were drawn in a room in Brussels by men who had never seen the land they were dividing. And those borders remain today, not because they work, but because changing them would require admitting they never should have been drawn in the first place. The map created the reality, and the reality created by that map has killed millions.